Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, folks. Michael Zuber, one rental at a time. And we are looking at some very short clips with some very interesting vocabulary. Mr. Millennial Mike has gone out and found one about infinite money. This is going to be a very interesting one to talk about.
Yeah, the Fed sat down, or someone from the Fed, whose name I could not find no matter how much I Googled it. And I wasn't willing to sign up for Paramount Plus to watch the full interview. But the Fed sat down with Scott Pelley with 60 Minutes. Now, this was back in 2020 when COVID was first kicking off and people were concerned about the economic state of things. Then the Fed sent somebody to go calm the nerves of investors and regular people. And so I want to see if you think what they say is actually calming.
To the person who is about to grab their car keys and go to the ATM and take out $3,000, you say what?
You don't need to. Your ATM is safe, your banks are safe, there's enough cash in the financial system, and there is an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve, an infinite
amount of cash at the Federal Reserve.
All right, Mike, what do you think?
So first off, I believe that's Neil Kashkari.
Okay, well, you know at least.
Yeah, he's the Fed president of, I want to say Chicago, but I could be wrong. Anyways, I think that is Neil Kashkari. I'm about 95% certain. So he's a Fed president. He's a big swinging, you know what. So a couple of things. This was 2020, right?
Yes, 2020.
So I would argue he proved it. They basically manufactured $8 trillion. Now, it's not infinite. Right. The word infinite, I disagree with. I mean, because that just mathematically hurts my head and it would be a problem. But for all intents and purposes, $8 trillion, that seems pretty infinite to most of us. Yeah. Stimulus ballers, you got your checks, you got your stimmy checks, PPP loans, rent forgiveness. The Fed proved it as far as I'm concerned. I think he's right. I think the Fed, $4 trillion in the span of like 9 months. I think he did exactly what he said he was going to do, or they said they were going to do. And while I do argue with the word infinite, because there is a cap, it's clearly more than 4 trillion, clearly more than 8 trillion. I don't like the word infinite, but I think what he was trying to do was calm people's nerves about basically doing a bank run on ATMs. So I think he used it because I don't think most people realize that. But again, I think he did exactly what he said they were going to do and manufactured, with the push of a button, $8 trillion and sent everybody money and sent money again and sent money again and sent money again. And now we are where we are. And remember, I did a video on the day 2 of the pandemic saying inflation is coming. Get ready. So, yeah, I saw this coming. So this is very predictable. And again, I believe that's Neil Kashkari, Fed president, I think of Chicago. I could be wrong.
So one follow-up question, there's a lot of tropes or quips out there that people say, people like to talk about, oh, we could just go back to the gold standard. Well, it's probably not going to happen. Another one that I see all the time, I've even seen in your comment section, I think from our friend Mark M, is the end the Fed. What do you think about ending? Is it even possible? How could it happen?
So I see that a lot. And I think I'm drawing a blank on his name. There's a guy that says why am I drawing a blank?
George Gammon.
Gammon, thank you.
Yeah.
He has in the Fed on his hat. And I watch some of George stuff. I like 70% of what he has to say. And I love how he teaches. I think he does a really good job. But in the Fed is a cute statement. But let's go back to 2020 and just ask you a question. So it's January of 2020. Nothing really much is going on. The economy is slowing down. We're probably headed to a normal business cycle recession. In an environment like that, the Fed's not there. It doesn't really matter. But then we have this once in a lifetime event where we shut the economy down. People stop going to work. Nobody's going to restaurants, all of this stuff. If we didn't have the Fed as the buyer of last resort, we could have gone back into the dark ages. The fact that the Fed was the buyer of last resort, now they stayed around too long, they did too much, they did all of those things. But I want to ask you, April, May, June, July, August 2020, if the Fed wasn't there as the buyer of last resorts, I don't even want to imagine what would have happened. So I would agree that the Fed 95% of the time is not needed, but they perform a vital and misunderstood function in our economy as the buyer of last resort when all hell breaks loose. If they weren't there, I mean, society could have broken down. I mean, literally, it could have broken down. I mean, just think, it could have broken down. People didn't have money. People weren't going to jobs. Unemployment went up like 10 million jobs in a month. Society could have broken down without the Fed. So I do believe that the Fed does too much. I believe they try to tinker. I believe they look for perfection, blah, blah, blah. You will not hear me say in the Fed, because there is that 5%, 3 standard deviation moves that if we didn't have them, the entire world today could have been different if the Fed and central banks weren't there. So I think that's misguided. I think they preserve a buyer of last resort, and we would be fundamentally different without them. So, and I don't think better. I think much worse. I mean, that's the next question. Some people might say, well, Michael, if the Fed wasn't there, we'd be better off. I would argue that's probably not true. So that's my thought.
I understand the point that you make, and I agree with it, but I also understand the counter argument that people would make, which is that ultimately, even though the Fed isn't technically a government institution, government interference is one of the leading causes of why people weren't going to restaurants and why the economy was slowing down. And because of all that government interference, we use other government-esque, the Fed interference to try to mediate or mitigate that situation. And so I think the detractor would say, well, if the government hadn't screwed things up in the first place, the Fed wouldn't have had to step in and save the day.
That's counterfactual, right? That's not an argument that I would tolerate. The Fed was there to bail out the financial system. They're not making CDC calls or mass calls or this or that. That's not their function. And they were nowhere around that. Other organizations made stupid calls, which if the Fed wasn't there, society as we know it could have ended. That's not the Fed's fault. That's not okay. That's not fair, in my opinion.
Well, an interesting topic. I've been meaning to ask you about the ending the Fed comments before, and just it popped into my head as we were watching this one. So even though sometimes they are the big boogeyman that seems to be ruining our investing hopes and aspirations, they do play a critical role at certain times. Mike, we got one more video to react to. You excited for it?
Absolutely. I love this.